Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. This is the High Caliber Man podcast, and I am Hugh Mayers. Today, I'll be flying solo. That's the first thing to put out there, and looking forward to doing a brief review of a theatre production that I recently went to see. I took my son to the theatre, and we watched this very, very intriguing production directed by Ryan Calais Cameron. I hope I haven't butchered the guy's name. The name of the production was For Black Boys, dot, dot, dot. Or that's how you often see advertised. But the full name of the production was For Black Boys Who Have Considered Suicide When the Hue Gets Too Heavy. Um, Really thought-provoking piece. And one of the things that I did like about the production, I would say about the play in general, was actually the production in the sense that, and I'm not going to put too many spoilers out there, but just giving a kind of an overview of the plot, that the set itself wasn't that expensive, but there's something different about when something is inexpensive and when something is cheap. It wasn't cheap. There was a level of creativity and a level of, genius would be a bit too extreme, but like just creativity and thought had gone into it. Um, so there was some lights, there was a step, there was, but it wasn't based on a whole load of props trying to recreate, a background scenery. I think the scenery was more a product of just the lighting and a combination of the conversations that were taking place or the action that was taking place. An example of that was they had sound, there was dialogue, and there was a scene where it was about, yes, black on black male violence, and they're breaking down the thoughts and feelings of the actor, the participants in that violent scene. They were given like their own narration of what was going on within them at the time, like on an emotional level. And then there was this sound playing in the background that it kind of heightened the emotionality of it all. So you kind of gripped. You found yourself. At least I did. I found myself quite gripped, and by going by the audience's responses throughout the play, you could see the audience were very engaged. So the fact that it wasn't a big like Broadway production or like the biggest theater in the whole of London or something of that nature, it didn't seem to have a negative impact because they had captured the audience's attention with the level of the script, the dialogue, and the interaction, and it was quite dynamic in throughout because one of the formulas it looked like they used was there would be a build-up of humor to kind of introduce a subject. Then it would get somewhat serious, sometimes even dark, as you know, the name of the play is the theme of suicide that popped up infrequently. But they were quite challenging subjects that came up to do with mental health, to do with abuse or whatever. I'll probably go into that in a little bit more detail without trying to spoil the plot, so that you could, if you hear this, you could still see it and be quite surprised. Um, but yeah, there was this kind of build up of first the humor to introduce it. Then there was this slow burn as the tension would mount and it would become more serious. It would kind of crescendo, a flashpoint, cataclysm, a disaster, or whatever it was that happened. And then there was music. This music was kept popping up and as a kind of catharsis in a certain way. And one of the things that stops me from going to the theater is because so many theater productions are musicals, and I have a strong dislike for musicals, very, very strong dislike for musicals. I'm more of a script man, more of a let me see this play as a form of acting, but it's live. Anything can happen. That's what's special about it for me, but not the music and the performance in the sense of all this singing and dancing and singing and dancing. However, this play did use some singing and dancing, some bits of rapping, but it's far for me to describe it as a musical. It's kind of hard to explain because how can it not be a musical when every so often they break into song and dance, but it doesn't. it doesn't have that kind of traditional musical formula or feel to it. It almost just feels like man, that bit was a bit heavy, so let's bust a tune just to shake it off and reset when we go into some more dialogue, or we use a song as a little bit of humor or whatever, a little bit of a vibe to create a club scene or whatever it is. But yeah, the overall script, or sorry, I say the overall plot, the overall storyline, I'd say entails six brethren, six guys, six black guys, or five black guys and a mixed race or super light skinned guy, because colorism was relevant to the place. And that's the only reason why I mentioned that he was super light skinned, because the other cast members were specifically dark, quite dark skinned brothers. So it's about the six of them and their interaction in the context of, well, was it a counseling session that breaks off into their individual shares and their individual stories? Was it some type of male intervention, and each man had a share, and each man's share was like his narrative, his story, his experiences, and where all these issues emanate from? Or yeah, was it just some sort of male safe space? But whatever the space, whatever the formula or formally was, they really did create a good platform for a lot of interesting dialogue and subject matters that needed to be fleshed out. Um, One of them that caught my attention, because there was so many to mention, but one of them that caught my attention was the roadman vis-a-vis the educated black man or black brethren, like one of them had used the N-word, and in just not in a negative way, as in sound like a paradox, right? But not as a form of an insult, but just as a quote unquote term of endearment, or just part of the lexicon, just part of the wordology of just talking and just referring to referring to a next black man, but in that sense. However, the educated guy took exception and said, I am not your N. I've never been your N. I despise this word. I resent this word. And so they had this kind of play out of, nah, this is our word. It's from where it's come from. The history, was used to abuse us, but we've reclaimed it. The old, the kind of old, it's almost cliched now, but, form of endearment, X, Y, and Z. But I thought it was an interesting, yeah, quite creative way of bringing it into the into the conversation or into the production. And thinking about it in the UK context, just to give a little bit of history, growing up I can go back pre-MTV, and that word in the UK was never ever used unless it was either by a racist white person just abusing black people, and that word was fighting talk or a cue for, man, that should be violence, or you got washed, you're outnumbered or something like that. But that was growing up in South London, growing up in Brixton, that was a kind of the psyche of that word was, no, that's something that we saw on Roots, or yeah, you got chased from Crystal Palace by some skinheads and you're 10 and you're 10 years old with a few of your 10-year-old friends, and the skinheads that chased you looked like teenagers, and there was 10 of them or something like that. That wasn't no word to throw about and use for any kind of form of endearment. Even I remember that word being so sensitive and so triggering that even if a black person, in the infrequent occasion when a black person would use that word, everybody would stop doing what they're doing, almost like the kind of stereotypical scene in a cowboy film where somebody's playing the piano and they're dancing and singing and they're making noise in this establishment, and then somebody steps in and then the whole music stops and everybody turns around and stares. It was that kind of moment. That word wasn't um yeah, the N-word wasn't no free-for-all and fun word, or a kind of, it wasn't a word of machismo or exclamation or to sound tough and sound street. It was nothing like that. Nothing like that. And it's interesting to see how its usage in the UK in terms of black people using it to refer to each other, or even now just to refer to men using it, black men using it to refer to other males, even if the male is of another um ethnic background, is it's interesting how this has emerged and developed. And I'd have to say the pre-MTV era and the post-MTV era, because before, I wouldn't say before hip hop, because hip hop is, goes back to the 70s, Planet Rock, African Bambaataa, Rock the Bells, Run DMC, My Adidas. There was no real use of that. So although we were in the UK, from a black perspective, although we came in contact with hip hop and was familiar with it, it wasn't really pushing that, and it wasn't on the telly. That was people owned the records, or you heard that on the pirate radio stations, what they call community radio stations now, gone to internet stations, right? But yeah, that word just wasn't the one. So I really appreciated the fact that they had that conversation. And it's more about a conversation as opposed to mind control, or being able, as a people, being able to just implement policy. But there's something very important about us having certain key conversations, and seeing what evolves, what emerges, and how the culture shifts and changes. But we need to have these, dialogue around certain key points. And I definitely think, yeah, in a wider context, that's a really an important point, or an important conversation, because there is an issue of black male representation, black male portrayal within the UK context, sort of historically affected by the transatlantic slave trade, affected by colonialism, and just old school 1960s, 70s, even 80s sort of prejudice and racism. And so news items, people only being, often black men in particular, only really given the microphone, at least back in the day. So we're talking historically, if it was something to do with sporting, if it was something to do with criminality, there were certain fixed roles, certain stereotypes, sexual objectification of, as I spoke about in the past, people like Linford Christie and certain sportsmen, or, not really appreciated for intellect, or for creativity, outside of certain really music, or certain confined genres of music, etc. So with that in mind, I think there are important conversations to be had, but it's something, the N word reminds me, or this conversation that needs to happen reminds me of how important it is. If people think it's important that we as black men in the UK upgrade, reform, redefine our image to influence others, I think it even starts before that, of how do we upgrade, reform, and redefine our image to affect our own psyches, about how we think and feel about ourselves, and the image that we project to young black boys who will become black men, um, over a period of time. Because nobody's born genetically. No black boy is born. They say things to do with DNA, genetics, um, ancestral voices. But nobody can convince me that there's an ancestral voice, or there's a genetic disposition to say, wear your trousers, where your underpants is showing. There's nothing genetic about that. Boys see that, see older men do that, and are socialized into that. And that's a simple, cliched, but simple representation of how boys are socialized about what's acceptable, not acceptable, what's fly, what's cool, what's swag, what's masculine, what's tough, what's alpha, etc., etc. So yeah, I think there's something that comes before we even want to impress other people or impact other people about, representations of ourselves. I think it goes literally to how we see ourselves individually and how we see ourselves collectively before that conversation extends to people outside of the group. But yeah, not to take up too much time on that, but just to say that I really appreciated that conversation, and it evolved in the dialogue into another conversation where it was between the two same actors, but one was more of a road you'd say, and one of them was, let's say, a graduate and a more corporate guy. And so they had this dialogue back and forth about, when you go to university, it's a white environment. The roadman is saying, so you're seen as a certain way. You're seen as an N-word by your your lecturer, your teacher. it doesn't really matter. And when you graduate and go to the corporate space, you think everything is all fine and that you're accepted. But if something goes wrong, um, like something goes missing as an issue of trust or whatever, then racism, white supremacy is a kind of dominant ideology behind all of it. That's what he's trying to say. And so you'll be the first to feel the pinch, or you'll be the first that will be the person suspected, and so on and so forth. And so they had this back and forth, and then like a kind of value system of what blackness is was mooted, was pushed around. So if you're educated, is that really the blackness? Is it authentic? Are you trying to be something else, or is it a roadman? Is the authentic and the street culture and the kind of swagger of a ruffian, right? Is that the more authentic blackness? And so they had this conversation. And again, these are quite, from my subjective point of view, but my analysis nonetheless, they're like really important, really super important conversations to have in the 21st century, amongst black men. Not exclusively, but because obviously there's a black community. But yeah, there's some deep conversations that I think that we need to have if we're in the process of reforming and reviving and empowering ourselves as an identity group, um, that hopefully will impact wider pockets of society, right? So these are some of the important conversations that we need to have. So yeah, again, I appreciated that it wasn't a super expensive set, with a whole load of lighting and technology and smoke and steam and mirrors and people, a massive cast, for example, or dancing girls or whatever. It's like six guys reasoning ultimately, and then they break into dance or into dialogue, or it gets dark. It got dark quite a few times. So there's like I said, those were very two of the quite pivotal themes for me. Stories. That I think those two are in some respects the main characters, in a sense, the more easier to shape. There was another character that was uh educated and somewhat more conservative as well. And he spoke about certain male sensitivities and issues as well. But I think it's that character um, later on transpired to be um, a homosexual. I'm not sure why that is even relevant or why I'm mentioning that. I don't know why that character didn't have what's the word I'm looking for? A shape. Like there's these archetypes of men, right? Or black men. I've heard Dr. T.S. and Johnson talk about that from the United States about the white knight, kind of man that indulges women and women can do no wrong. A man that kind of fails to um hold women accountable, or the thug, or the educated Princeton and Harvard kind of guy who's a bit of a political mercenary, and he goes through these different archetypes, and I could kind of see using that template how they had fit the various cast members, but some fit easier more than others, if I can put it that way. They had a certain particular shape. So yeah, that character spoke about certain male sensitivity things, but this character just was interested and was more of a supporting role. There was another character, a light skinned brother, mixed, either super light skin or mixed race brother, and his role, his character, sort of the fit into an easily digestible sort of archetype of the sweet boy, the gallus, talks about how he gets girls. Um, but he raised a very interesting point about how this inability to really connect with women. So there's a kind of superficiality for some heterosexual men that while they may have a quadrillion sexual encounters with different women, but they know very little about women or about relationships beyond the seduction, because there's a very strong fear that is uh, preventing them from entering into like relational depth and vulnerability and being open and really connecting beyond the sort of beyond the sort of sexual and the conquest. And so like that character really outlined that in a really easy to understand way. And I could, you're picking up the vibes of the audience and stuff like that. And the place was full of women and full of black women. And you could hear the gasp, the urs, and the facial expressions. You could see that they were gripped. You could see that they were gripped, definitely gripped by that. And listen to the conversations in the intermission before we go into like part two and stuff like you kind of pick up that, certain things really connected, certain things really resonated. And I think that was definitely one of the themes. um, Maybe it shed some light. Maybe it helped some women to understand, get a bit more insight because um, the brilliance of this play, and I would give it, actually, I'll save what I'll give it out of five for a little close to when I finish. But I think the brilliance about what the play did is that black men in the UK, in the arts, are often one-dimensional and stereotyped. However, as opposed to archetypes, very cheesy stereotypes, um, that may be to do with who's paying for the production. Um, it might be to do with who's doing the writing, where they come from, what's their encounters with black men from different walks of society. It may be just to do with capitalism about what sells. Um, I think sometimes even black men do it to themselves. When you watch certain drill videos, and listen to certain songs and stuff like that. I work with young people, so I try to keep up to speed. And it's super one-dimensional and formulaic that if you did know better, you'd think, okay, so some of these videos are from a time when these were put together by, white producers that have not been around black people and white directors, and it's a white owned label. But a lot of these guys are independent with the growth of the internet. A lot of these guys use their entrepreneurial and their hustling and street knowledge to kind of like go it alone. And so they're literally on their own ticket, but still it's I don't know, not a minstrel show, but it's really awful like when you're watching it. But at the same time, I'm from a different age group. And so I say it with a let me see me level of empathy and kind of understanding of youth and youth culture and the demands and maybe like the kind of the masculine prison, the limitations that are set if you want to portray yourself and not be, seen as a punk. There's a ultra masculinity that sometimes needs to be projected and or street cred, So sometimes it's self-inflicted, but yeah, as I said, the genius of this play is that it put dimensions by having the characters that were very different, but also the fact that they were different, but they had different elements to them that showed up throughout the play at different times. So yeah, I think that you know the it felt like the vibe of the sister in them that they kind of like were gaining some insight into a bit more of the humanity and complexity of men as opposed to just seeing like a moral some of these men that have these moral indiscretions. It just comes out of them just being not nice people. And sometimes they are not, man, them will argue, like, sometimes they're just not nice people, right? But there's there's more to it than them just not being nice. Like there might be other driving factors like personality, insecurities, um, and sometimes an inability to go beyond a certain point. So, they just wash, spin, rinse, and repeat. And another important topic that came up was sexual abuse that came up, and not sexual abuse male on male, as in boys that have been tampered with by older, bisexual or homosexual men, but no, um, boys that have been sexually molested by females, whether older relative or older some kind of connection, whoever had access to them, but somebody that was older. Um, is it's a very taboo topic for a number of different reasons. Um, Not just because sexual abuse is taboo, but to put boys and or black men in that role is kind of unheard of, really. Like to, appreciate black men's vulnerabilities. So yeah, that was another deep aspect of the production that they put in, or the plot. I keep saying production. Another deep aspect of the production, and it was basically showing how this had traveled with this person into adulthood, the consequences, the psychological and the physiological consequences that had moved with this person throughout their life. And so they were not in a position to maybe share that with females, women that they had, as adult men now grown up, that person couldn't necessarily share that, didn't feel comfortable, didn't feel able to share that. But it had been something that would impact their adult life in terms of romantic partnership, with a woman. And so I thought that was kind of like groundbreaking. That was a bit out there. Because, as I said, it's something that's never talked about. And what's so annoying about that is we can clearly have the capacity and ability to see an adult male who has sexual relations with a um, underage girl, RAPE. It's easily codified as that. But when it's the other way around and it's a heterosexual woman that's above age and an underage male, meaning a boy, um, sometimes you read articles about a teacher with a student, they'll say they had a sexual relationship for 6 months, and you're like, how does that work? That is RAPE. That's forced penetration or statutory RAPE. So really not really struggling to understand the logic, but maybe it's something that we could pick up in another conversation. But yeah, there is something that needs to be expanded on in that, and even if that's for the sake of not demonizing one or ain't or yeah, not to demonize, but just to say we need to make children safe. When people sometimes say, girls are not protected. No, children need to be protected, man. Children need to be protected. Children need protected. And for moral reasons, but also for pragmatic reasons as well. Like you don't, you just, people in society you don't need to have a section of society that it's easier for them to be exploited or damaged, because sometimes hurt people hurt people. So even if it's just on a pragmatic level, although I think there's a higher moral calling, but even if it's just a pragmatic level, that yeah, man, we need to keep our eyes open for that, and we need to develop a conversation about that as well. And in particular, within the context of Black boys, because children across all demographics, it's not a Black thing. Children across all demographics and classes can be subject to abuse, but if you think it's socioeconomically, in terms of image and perceptions of Black boys going into Black men, it could be a group that's definitely seen as the least vulnerable, and they could actually be the most vulnerable. Because, for example, in the United States, the figures say that the African American boys are the youngest group to be introduced to sex, as in I'm not saying it in the correct way, so I'm going to just break it down to make it clear that the average age that um, ethnic group B might have for boys to become sexual might be like 15, and group C might be 14. But African American boys is like 9 years old. They made the average age, or the common age or whatever is something like 9 years old or 10 years old. So it's like a good few years compared to other groups. So yeah, it's just something to bear in mind. Um, there's another important point that they raise in the production, in the plot, me and this production thing, in the plot, and that was to do with um like how we deal with health. Like there was a health scare, and male vulnerability or inability to be transparent and stuff like that. So that was another important point that came up in the plot. Um, and the violence, yeah, the youth violence as well. It it gave another depth, another layer to how young men, boys, teenagers youth can get caught up in violence because of grooming and being socialized and the kind of expectations. And I think it's as much a class thing as it is a race thing. I don't think you could explain it by a race. I know if you look at the data and you look at children from boys from lower social economic areas and or stratas of society, whatever their racial background, white, Asian, whatever, black, whatever, you'll find more correlations with certain types of behavior to do with, violence. And again, even when it comes to sociologically, who fights the wars in societies is boys between a certain, young men to boys between a certain age group. Who is involved in most gang violence? You boys, males between a certain age group. So it doesn't matter about the society or the ethnicity. There's a certain thing about boys in particular um, that resonates with that aggression. And it's usually from a certain strata of society. So if you were to go to somewhere like Ghana, even if they were like young youth violence, it's not going to be with the sons of the judges and the politicians. And just likewise, if you used to go to Jamaica or something like that, and there's violence, it's going to be in the majority of it's going to be predominantly in the working class and underclass and underserved and underprivileged, all of the under. If you all understand what I say, like, those areas and those sections of society, that's where you'll find the majority of the violence, not with the sons of the entrepreneurs and the educated and, those that fly to Miami because they got a, scholarship or whatever. It's not going to be with them. Right. So that thing about the youth violence, it was an important conversation, an extremely important one that we need to have in the community. Again, if we're talking about, redirecting our energy, reforming our image, redefining our image as Black men, and that means really Black males because we're talking about from boys to men because um, it's important, it's crucial, it's pivotal that that really takes place. And I'm going to emphasize this that before we even start to think about trying to impress or influence or garner the support of any other group, any other ethnic group or any other gender or gender, like there's different gender that will make to even impress women or girls or whatever, just as our own, just to affect our own self-image and our own psyche, our own appreciation and recognizing our own humanity and complexity, strengths and vulnerabilities. It has to, well, they say charity starts at home. So that's an enormous conversation that needs to happen. But yeah, I'd say there's so much to go into that. I'd be here forever, or ages at least. And also, I don't really want to spoil it, but I would say overall, with the raising of the internal violence, the use of sexuality as a kind of sex addiction to anesthetize emotional pain, sexual abuse. There's also about physical abuse and parenting, the use of the N-word, conservative vis-a-vis more liberal political leanings, um, social economics, education, blackness as a concept, blackness as a social construct, the use of history, why some black people reject going back into our history because it's always portrayed as us getting whooped and washed and rinsed out and then the counter argument is that before, those of us that were our ancestors were brought to the West by force. Before that, we had very sophisticated and complex civilizations and methods of governance and living. And we need to study that part as well to empower ourselves and not just, see ourselves as victims. So there were, all these different themes interwoven quite neatly. I would give the play a 3 out of 5. I remember when I put that up on my story on my WhatsApp, some people looked, there were some emojis like to say, oh, disappointment. But I don't know if I wasn't able to articulate it just in script. I put 3 out of 5, but I'd say it's a strong 3 out of 5. I could I couldn't give it a 4 or a 5 for the reason. My reason is that it's like a brilliant idea that was executed well, but it wasn't brilliant or excellent. It was executed well. was done well. So I would definitely encourage people to go and see it. And I think by the fact that it started at a very local and very small theater and it's moved a few times and it was only it's been extended and brought back. So those are all the signs that that's what you need to know, right? That it's been appreciated. Um and I think that it's probably gonna get, yeah, I could see it going on, coming back, even changing a little bit and even being stronger, developing because um I have information to say that they've changed actors and they've slightly modified the script every so often. So um yeah, I think I might even go and see it again. Shout out to London's finest. I might be going to see it with um my broskies. Um to watch it from a kind of masculinist perspective with my counseling and therapist team. So yeah, we shall see. So I couldn't do all of the minutia of the script because I don't want to spoil. And just wanted to give you a flavor. But yeah, ultimately, I think that the if the vision and the production or the idea behind it was to flesh out and trigger debate. And I think they've done their thing. It would definitely trigger debate. And there was things about it I didn't um, like for example, the homosexual character didn't have a shape, didn't have depth. It just seemed a bit like, and this is my own bias, and I'm going to own it. Like it's one of the trending things that we got to put a gay character in there just to tick a box. It's almost like he could have not been gay. He could have just been like he could have been a female, but I'm born a female, but I'm a trans man, or so just because like that's what's not virtue. Do they call that virtue signaling? I don't know the right word for it right now, but like yeah, that seemed bolted on, glued in. It just felt a bit yeah for me. It felt a little bit artificial. Um, but what was good about that in the sense that they didn't overdo it from my own personal taste and my own bias. They didn't overdo it. There wasn't anything graphic um, that was kind of wild or out there. Like if sometimes you watch some TV films and if there's something of that nature and it's not your cup of tea, you think like, raw, man, I have to turn this, or it's just not you, just being frank and congruent. Whereas they were just trying to put the idea out there and have that conversation. They didn't go too far. So that was a good thing. And ultimately I think I go by the crowd's overall engagement. You can sense when something's vibing when you're in a room, right? Or if you've gone to the cinema or you've gone somewhere, you're taking in something, you're not just watching it by yourself, but you're in an environment. And you could definitely tell that there was the crowd was, the audience was really following it and there was a vibe. Um, Also, there was something about colorism, not the light skin character, but also colorism as in black men's preference in dating women. And, some may say that there was a kind of pandering to black women or darker the berry, sweeter the juice type of narrative. And I love my queen and my dark skin queen and stuff like that. And I know there are some that would say that it felt like pandering, but I did I the I didn't appreciate it. I appreciated it that conversation in the play. I didn't experience it like pandering. It seemed authentic. It seemed genuine. It seemed real. Or yeah, it was something authentic about it. It didn't seem like it's just saying it for saying its sake. Um, But while there were, a few, I don't want to open up another chasm, but a few elements where in the play where it felt like, could they be pandering to a white audience? I mean, it's a production, it's in the UK. And that often happens with black art. Like there's a conversation about black art. Is it colonized art or is it, anti-colonial, not anti, but, liberated art, for want of a better term. Um, yeah, even anti-colonial. Yeah, man. Why can't? Yes, anti-colonial. Yes, say that. Yeah, but what I mean is that this thing about when we as racialized people, when we as Black people make art or make a product, is it made for the primary audience, as in your people, and whomever wants to consume and appreciates that flavor and that texture and that rhythm, or the lights or the color or the sound that they appreciate for what it is in its essence, and it's like a kind of level of artistic integrity, or is it sometimes made where, well, man, that's to pay his bill, you know what I'm saying? Like, man, that's to eat, so I'm gonna make it a little bit BBC One friendly, or a kind of appeal to the kind of mainstream dominant society to feel comfortable with it. So there is that. Yeah, they may or may not have been elements of that within the plot and production. However, it is no mean criticism or no sellout. It's just kind of is what it is, isn't it? Like, people have to do what they do. And I'm not saying it's absolutely that's the case, but I'm just saying that's a kind of consideration that I guess comes up in art oftentimes. It's just like reminds me when I'm like driving in my car and I'm listening to certain music that's on the radio, because I don't really always play I don't have certain type of music on CD or download it or whatever, or certain new music. I have old music. I have music from whether it's dancehall or whether it's R&B, whether it's hip hop. It tends to be the more older stuff. But if I'm driving on radios on now, this is new stuff, and a lot of the UK stuff. I must admit, when I listen to One Extra, I think sometimes, did that brother write that song because he wanted to get that message across, or is he just thought of some clever catchphrasy things that he thinks will sell his records? And so it's not the fact that you ain't gifted or you ain't got a talent, but it's like, you kind of question. Sometimes you're listening to some of the things that said, you think, question that person's artistic integrity at least. Like, do you really mean that, or are you just saying that? Like a politician, do you mean that you believe in these principles and these policies, or are you just saying that because you want people to vote for you, kind of thing? So it's one of them things, isn't it? But yeah, overall, long story short, 3 out of 5, but a strong 3 out of 5. Definitely go and see it. And yeah, man. If you do leave a comment um in the comment section, if you have seen it and you heard and you hear this podcast, yeah. But remember to like, share, subscribe, and as I always say, smash the subscribe button for your free subscription. Till next time, peace.